So I want to please introduce Sonia Pettick. Sonia is a research associate at PPIC, and she was the project manager on the survey that we're going to talk about today. So please welcome Sonia Pettick.
Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. Can everybody in the back hear me all right? Yes, wonderful. I thought I'd start the survey today with a couple of questions for all of you. So first off, how many of you think that Governor Brown and the state legislature will be able to work together and accomplish a lot this year? Just a show of hands. Fair number. And how many of you think that President Obama and the US Congress will be able to work together and accomplish a lot this year? That's what I thought. So a lot of you are very much similar to the Californians that we interviewed in our survey this time. And that's just a little preview of what we'll be talking about today. And actually the findings from those particular questions are on the handout that you picked up on your way in. Page 1 has the chart for the state legislature and governor, and the page 2 has President Obama and the US Congress. Okay, so wonderful. The current survey, for those of you who are unfamiliar with our work, is a continuation of PPIC's ongoing series of surveys which started in 1998. We have conducted more than 135 surveys on a range of topics and have interviewed nearly 300,000 Californians in that time. The intent of the survey really is to provide timely, nonpartisan data on the political, social, and economic opinions of Californians. We hope to inform and improve the state policymaking process, raise awareness, encourage discussion, and provide a voice for Californians in important state policy debates, including both voters and non-voters alike. The current survey is part of our Californians and Their Government series, which is conducted numerous times each year to measure attitudes toward fiscal and governance issues, candidate elections, ballot propositions, and state and national policy issues. The current survey was conducted after the release of the governor's budget proposal for the next fiscal year. The proposal was leaked on a Thursday, and we started conducting interviews the following Tuesday. It focuses in on Californians' fiscal attitudes and reactions to the budget proposal, and also includes some questions about healthcare and immigration policy. We interviewed about 1,700 Californians age 18 and over. Of those, we consider about 1,100 to be likely voters. Interviews were conducted in both English and Spanish and on landline and cell phones. The margin of error for the total sample taking design effects from weighting into consideration is plus or minus 3.8 percentage points. This is a chart that is also on your handout on page 1. I think it's the first chart in the top right-hand side of your handout. This is really one of the survey's key findings this time. We find that heading into a gubernatorial election year and with the months ahead dealing with the budget, we find record high job approval ratings for Governor Brown. Certainly a bettering economy and additional state revenues are likely helping, but we really saw a bump for Governor Brown. For example, last month in our survey, 47% of Californians approved, so this was a jump of 11 points just since last month. And you can also see sort of a trend here. We included on this slide approval ratings from when he first took office in 2011. Up until today. And for a long time, there were a lot of Californians who were unsure of how to rate the governor's job performance. And then after the 2012 elections, in 8 surveys between the 2012 elections and today, we found that about close to 50% of Californians were saying they approved of Governor Brown. So this was really sort of a change in attitudes. And we also see that 6 in 10 of those we consider likely to vote say that they approve of the governor. We find that when it comes to the California legislature, 42% of Californians say that they approve of the job that it's doing. And although this is obviously much lower than the job approval ratings for Governor Brown, this 42% is actually near the record high that we've ever recorded for the legislature. The previous high was either 43 or 44% back in 2004. So this is actually saying something here. However, we do find that when we look at our group of likely voters, approval of the state legislature drops to 33%. We also find that nearly half of Californians approve of their own state assembly members and state senators. This is the highest job approval that we've seen since December 2007. You can see here, however, that there is a party divide, with most Democrats saying they approve of their own legislators and most Republicans saying that they disapprove, and independent voters are more evenly divided. We also see that likely voters are divided on this issue. When we look at these findings across the state's regions, we find that approval of their own state legislators is highest in the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, each January, we start the survey off with an open-ended question about what people think is the most important issue for the governor and state legislature to work on that year. It will likely not surprise you that for the past several years, the top issues that Californians have named include jobs in the economy, the state budget situation, and education. And those three issues, again, are the most important that Californians name today. Let me see if I can. Yeah, so 10% for budget, 13 for schools, and 26 for jobs in the economy. But there are some differences I thought that I would, or some changes over time that I thought I would note for you. So for example, as the economy and state budget situation have been improving over the last several years, we've seen that the share saying jobs in the economy is down somewhat, the share saying the state budget situation is down somewhat. So for example, in 2011, the share saying the state budget situation was the most important problem was 13 points higher than it is today. Today we see some other issues also cropping up, including immigration, water and drought, and healthcare. And in fact, the percentage naming the drought or water issues, 7% is a record high naming that particular issue. We also find that when we look at some of the state's regional and demographic and political groups, the percentage naming water and drought is especially high in the Central Valley at 18%. And then we also see that partisans prioritize different issues. So for instance, Democrats are much more likely than Republicans to say education is the top issue. Republicans much more likely to say the state budget is the most important issue. This is an open-ended question, actually. Yeah. Okay, so here is the question we started out the discussion with. Since Governor Brown took office in January 2011, we've asked this question each year to sort of see whether Californians think that the governor and legislature will be able to cooperate and get something done. We find that a majority this year say that Governor Brown and the legislature will be able to work together and accomplish a lot. And findings were nearly identical last year and when Governor Brown took office in 2011. In 2012, Californians were less optimistic. This is obviously a far cry from what we see at the federal level, but we'll talk about federal issues in a little bit. We find that across parties, Democrats are the most likely to say that the two will be able to work together and accomplish a lot. We also find that strong majorities of those who either approve of the governor's job performance, the legislature's job performance, or their own state legislators' job performance are likely to say that there will be cooperation at the state level. The survey finds that a slim majority of Californians think that things in the state are generally going in the right direction. We do find that likely voters are more closely divided on this question. And we find that about half of Californians expect that the state will have good times financially in the coming 12 months. This is obviously not an outpouring of optimism, but I thought I'd take a moment to put these findings into perspective for you, to show you how far we've come. I found this quite remarkable, actually. So in July 2009, just 14% of Californians thought things were going in the right direction, and it was in single digits for likely voters. Similarly, on our question about the economic outlook for the state, we found a low of 15% in July 2009, the summer of 2008, saying that they expected good economic times for the state in the next 12 months. Similar shares of likely voters held that view. So things are looking a lot better from the perspective of residents today. Of course, not everybody is optimistic about the outlook for the state. We do find that majorities of Republicans say that the state is going in the wrong direction and they expect bad economic times. We also find, for example, that women are slightly more pessimistic than men on both of these questions. So now I want to start talking about some of the fiscal issues that we included in the survey. This is where the survey was most heavily focused this time around. And actually, before I get into these findings, it was really interesting in planning the survey this time because I realized how accustomed I had become to asking questions such as, what area of the state budget do you most want to protect from spending cuts? What area of the state budget would you be willing to cut? Would you be willing to pay more taxes just to maintain the current levels of state spending for these various budget areas? And we were realizing, putting the questionnaire together, that it really, we'd been in the doldrums for so long that even this, this little bit of a budget surplus was a nice change of pace. But anyway, I wanted to provide this time trend on this question to also show how Californians are slightly more hopeful about the situation. So today we currently find that 50% of Californians say that the state's budget situation is a big problem, and another 40% consider it somewhat of a problem. So people really are still concerned about the state's fiscal house. But when you look at this time trend, since the governor took office, for most of the time that he's been in office, about 7 in 10 said that the state's budget situation was a big problem. And the drop that we see today, this is the lowest share that we've found saying big problem since May 2007, before the recession. This is another chart that is on your handout, if you care to look at that. It's the bottom chart on page 1. Governor Brown is obviously promoting fiscal prudence in his budget proposal for the next year. But we wanted to find out from Californians whether they thought any budget surplus should be used to pay down the state's wall of debt, or if they wanted to restore some funding for social services that have been cut in recent years. We find that 54% of Californians would prefer to use any budget surplus to pay down debt and build up the state's reserve, whereas 42% would prefer to restore some funding for social service programs. We also asked this question last January and May, and results were largely similar to this. As you might expect, most Republicans would prefer to use any extra money to pay down debt and build up the reserve. A slim majority of Republicans say that they would prefer to restore funding for social service programs, but even among this group, 43% think that it would be a good idea to pay off some of the state's debt. We periodically include 2 questions in our surveys to find out how well Californians understand some of the basic facts about the state budget. And if you've been to one of our briefings in the past, when we've presented these findings, you will likely not be surprised by today's numbers. The fact of the matter is that most Californians do not know where the state spends most of its money. We find that only 17% of Californians think that most of the state's money is spent on K-12 education. The largest share, 38%, think that the state spends most of its money on prisons and corrections. Another 30% say health and human services. So we first started asking this question in May 2005, and the share saying K-12 education has never been higher than 30%. In recent years, in this survey, we have seen a decline from recent years in the share saying that the state spends most of its money on prisons and corrections. For example, in January 2010, half of Californians thought that that was where most of the money went. We don't have any questions in the survey to find out exactly what accounts for that changing perception. It may be due to realignment, I'm not sure. But there's a very similar story when it comes to the state's major sources of revenue. Just 26% correctly identify the personal income tax as the major source of state revenue. Slightly more name the state sales tax. And we found a similar range of respondents naming the personal income tax over time since we started asking this question in 2005. Now, if we take a look at these two questions together, only 6% of Californians can correctly name both the top spending area and the top revenue source. So there's a lot of misinformation out there among Californians. So we wanted to find out how Californians felt about increasing spending in those top four budget areas. And you can see from this that most people, that's the area that people think most of the money is going, and that is not an area where they want to see increased spending. We find an overwhelming majority say that the state should increase spending on K-12 public education, and this is true among likely voters, is true across parties, regions, racial and ethnic, and other demographic groups. We also find that 3 in 4 Californians would like to increase spending on higher education, and we also find majorities across the various groups supporting this idea. There starts to be a little bit of a breakdown on the issue of health and human services. 2 in 3 Californians overall support this idea, but a majority of Republicans, for example, opposes increasing spending in that area. And then very few want to increase spending on prisons and corrections. And obviously this is an area the state will likely have to increase spending to comply with the federal court order to reduce prison overcrowding. We find that fewer than 3 in 10 across parties, regions, and demographic groups favor the idea of increasing spending in this area, except in the Inland Empire, where 36% would favor that. The survey included 4 questions about some fiscal reform ideas, including a general question about increasing the size of the state's rainy day fund. We also included a question about the governor's specific proposal to make changes to the rainy day fund, and I'll talk about that in a few slides. But we find that the vast majority of Californians, including likely voters and voters across parties, favor the general idea of increasing the size of the state's rainy day fund and requiring above average revenues to be deposited into it for use during economic downturns. Although the state already has a rainy day fund, it's failed to make consistent payments into it during the economic downturn, and there is an initiative already set for the November 2014 ballot that would make some changes to it, and Governor Brown is proposing a different type of proposal that would replace that initiative if the legislature agrees. So in any case, when it comes to this general idea of increasing the size of the rainy day fund, Californians are very much for it, and we've found strong support since first asking this in May 2010. Another idea, which I don't have a slide for, is the idea of a strict state spending limit. And that is also popular with Californians. More than 6 in 10 adults, or about 6 in 10 adults and likely voters, say that they favor the idea of strictly limiting the amount that state spending could increase in each year. And this has been a popular idea over time as well. The survey included 2 of the other reforms that we asked about were about Proposition 13 reforms. Obviously, since the 2012 elections, when the Democrats gained a 2/3 majority in the state legislature, there has been a lot of discussion about possibly tweaking some of the Proposition 13 rules, one of which is to lower the vote threshold to pass local special taxes from 2/3 to a 55% majority vote. The proposals thus far have gotten nowhere in the legislature, but it's still an issue that's being discussed. We find that Californians are divided about the idea of lowering the vote to 55% to pass local special taxes, and likely voters are slightly more opposed than in favor of the idea. On this issue, we find that a solid majority of Republicans oppose the idea. Democrats are slightly more likely to favor it, and independents are divided. We've found sort of mixed results on this question over the years. For instance, throughout the worst of the economic downturn, we found that slightly higher shares were in favor. As many as 54% said that they would favor the idea of lowering the vote to pass local special taxes. But prior to this recession, Californians were either divided like they are today or were more likely to oppose the idea. The other Proposition 13 reform that we included in the survey is this idea of taxing commercial properties at their current market value, creating a so-called split roll property tax. We find Californians are much more likely to favor this idea than to favor the idea of lowering the vote to pass local special taxes. Since we first started asking this question in June 2003, we've found that around 60% of Californians say they favor the idea. 6 in 10 likely voters today favor this idea, and you can see here that Democrats and independents are far more likely than Republicans to express support. Okay, so as I mentioned before, we wanted to ask Californians about their perspectives on the governor's budget proposal. And I think I've broken every rule in the book on how to create a good PowerPoint slide, but I wanted to show you all of the question exactly as we read it to respondents. We tried to summarize the basic framework of the governor's budget plan, which is to increase spending on K-12 education and higher education, modest increases for health and human services, prisons and corrections and courts, $11 billion to pay down state debts, including repayment of deferrals to K-12 schools, as well as paying off the economic recovery bonds. And then we also mentioned that the plan would put $1.6 billion into the state's rainy day fund, and that it included no new taxes. We find that very strong majorities of Californians and likely voters and voters across parties say they favor the governor's budget plan. Each January, we have asked about his budget proposals, and this is the highest level of support that we've found. I'm sure it helps that there's extra money to do something with. And for example, when we asked about his first budget in 2011, we've seen double-digit increases across parties this year in support of this particular plan. We also find, interestingly, that, well, not surprising, those who approve of the job that Governor Brown is doing as governor very much favor this budget proposal, but we also find that among those who disapprove, a majority actually approve of his budget plan. And then, as I mentioned, we included a question about his particular proposal to change the state's rainy day fund. Again, we provided a brief description for the respondents. We mentioned that among other things, this constitutional amendment would base deposits on capital gains revenues. It would create a reserve for K-12 public schools, and it would set limits on how the funds can be withdrawn during an economic downturn. In general, we find again that support is quite high for this plan. 7 in 10 adults and 2 in 3 likely voters say that they support it. We also find majority support across parties, although it's lower for Republicans than for Democrats or independents. When we compare this question to the general question about increasing the size of the state's rainy day fund, we find that among both those who favor and those who oppose the general idea of increasing the size of the rainy day fund, majorities support this particular plan to change the rainy day fund. Although the governor certainly didn't offer any silver bullets for repairing or planning for the long-term liabilities, he did mention them when discussing the state's wall of debt. We've been tracking attitudes toward the state's pension system for some time, and we find that today more than 8 in 10 Californians and likely voters consider the amount of money spent by state and local governments on their public employee pension or retirement systems to be a problem. 43% of adults consider it to be a big problem. But we find likely voters are more likely than adults overall to say that it's a big problem. And we also find that Republicans are by far more likely than Democrats to say that it's a big problem. We started asking this question in January 2005 and have found that more than 3 in 4 Californians consider pensions to be at least somewhat of a problem, but the share saying that it's a big problem is higher in recent years compared to that time. One of the changes that's often discussed in addressing long-term liabilities is changing the rules for new public employees. So when we started asking about pensions in general, we also started asking this question about whether people would favor or oppose changing the pension systems from a defined benefit system to a defined contributions system similar to a 401k plan. And we have found strong support over time for this idea. Today we find at least 2 in 3 across parties also favor this idea. And then among those who say that the pension system is a big problem, we find that 8 in 10 say would favor this type of change to the pension system. Now, our survey did ask about the governor's race, but the candidates made it a little tricky for us this time. So 2 days into interviewing, Republican Abel Maldonado dropped out of the race. So what we did for the people who said they supported him, we called them back to find out who they would now support without him in the race. And then on our final day of interviewing, Republican Neil Kashkari announced his intent to run. So we didn't, so we're sort of, downplaying the overall findings on the governor's race a bit since we didn't have the full mix of candidates. We will be including Neil Kashkari in our next survey. Before I mention this question, I'll just mention, so basically in a head-to-head between Governor Brown and Republican Tim Donnelly, we find that 53% of those we consider likely to vote would support Brown, whereas 17% say they would vote for Donnelly, and 28% are still unsure at this point. But it's really quite early, and in fact, you can see from this particular slide that no one's really paying that close of attention to the governor's race. 7% say they're very closely following it, just another 21% say they're fairly closely. The lion's share, 7 in 10, say they're not following it too closely at all. We do find that attention to news about candidates is quite a bit lower than it was in January 2010, prior to the last election. Of course, at that time, we didn't have an incumbent, so that likely affects attention to the race. But the other question we asked was, how do likely voters feel about the selection of candidates? We find that a plurality, but fewer than half, say that they're satisfied with the choice of candidates. 34% say they're not satisfied. But the real story here is the party findings. So most Democrats say they are satisfied, but Republicans are more likely to say they're dissatisfied than satisfied, and independents are divided. These findings are, the overall findings are similar to what we found among likely voters in December, but we have seen satisfaction increase 10 points among Democrats and 8 points among independents, and go down 7 points among Republicans. We'll see later in later surveys, how the addition of Kashkari affects levels of satisfaction, or if it doesn't change them at all. But one finding I did want to point out before moving on, so if we take a look at the likely voters who support Brown, a strong majority say that they're satisfied with their choices of candidates. Among those who support Donnelly, we find that 51% say they're dissatisfied. So these are the people saying that they would vote for Donnelly. So the half of them are dissatisfied with their choices and 20% don't know. But I should also add, in our December survey, we asked how people felt about each of the candidates, and we found that 7 in 10 likely voters didn't know who Tim Donnelly was. So it'll be interesting to keep tracking these things, and as the candidates become more well-known, we'll see what happens. Okay, so quickly, we had a few questions about some federal issues. This is a chart that is on page 2 of your handout, if you want to look there. We always, or often, track approval ratings of President Obama in the U.S. Congress. And unlike findings at the state level, we're seeing more negativity at the federal level. Approval ratings of President Obama among all adults are near the record low 51% that we had last month. And among likely voters, it's at a record low, 46%. You see that there was a steep drop since January of last year for President Obama. We really saw the decline happen after the government shut down and as the Affordable Care Act was being, the enrollment period for the Affordable Care Act was happening. We also see very low job approval ratings for the U.S. Congress, but amazingly, this is up 8 points since last month. They were down at a record low of 18% in December. And then I'd mention, we like to compare the opinions of Californians to those of adults nationwide taken in national surveys. So for President Obama, a recent Pew Research Center USA Today poll found that approval was in the low 40s. So even though Californians are near their lowest point, it's still about 10 points higher than adults nationwide. And then for Congress, a recent Gallup poll found that only 13% of adults nationwide say they approve of Congress. So it's, I'm not sure what explains the higher approval rating for Congress in California compared to nationwide. When it comes to the U.S. Congress, overwhelming majorities across parties say that they disapprove of their job performance. Californians are much more positive about their own representative to the House, especially Democrats. We have somewhat more mixed opinions from Republicans, independents, and likely voters. And then here was our other question we started our discussion with, and this is another one on your handout. Californians are very pessimistic about the chances for cooperation at the federal level. After the 2012 elections, there was a somewhat surprising, at least to me, glimmer of optimism that they would be able to work together, and in light of everything that's happened in the last year, pessimism really increased quite a bit since last year. And it's now sort of amazing in retrospect to look back and see that 81% of Californians thought President Obama and the U.S. Congress would be able to work together and accomplish a lot when he first took office. I'm sure it likely helped that at that time Democrats had control of both houses, but it's, this chart's a little depressing, frankly. We also asked approval ratings of our U.S. senators, Senator Feinstein and Senator Boxer. We find that slim majorities say that they approve of each. And likely voters are more closely divided about both senators. And not surprisingly, voters are deeply divided along party lines when it comes to approval ratings of both Senator Boxer and Feinstein. We also find that each senator has their highest ratings in the San Francisco Bay Area, where they're both from. When it comes to their handling of the deficit and debt ceiling, we find that Californians are divided about whether they approve or disapprove of President Obama's job in this area, while a strong majority disapprove of the way the Republicans in Congress are handling this particular issue. What was interesting is that during the period that we were conducting the interviews, Congress and President Obama signed a $1.1 trillion spending bill. So yesterday I was thinking about it, and I was wondering if the interviews, conducted before that or after that, if there was any difference in approval ratings. The findings were the same for the president. There was a slight bump in approval for the Republicans in Congress. But both of these figures today represent a decline from last January. At that time, 56% of Californians approved of the way the president was handling this issue. Approval of congressional Republicans was only slightly higher. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, we had some questions on healthcare policy and immigration reform. So I'll quickly go through these. So we wanted to find out how Californians view the healthcare law, generally speaking, and find that they're very much divided on it. And these findings are almost identical to what we found in December. This is a question that we took from the Kaiser Family Foundation. They asked this question nationwide. They find that an even smaller share of adults nationwide have a generally favorable opinion of the healthcare law. This issue really divides voters. A majority of Republicans have an unfavorable opinion of the law, while a majority of Democrats have a favorable opinion. The findings among the uninsured sort of mirror the overall findings, and they're also very similar to those with insurance. So there's really no difference whether or not you have health insurance. The attitudes are pretty much the same. And then last month in our survey, we asked people if they were aware that California had an insurance exchange. And we found that nearly 7 in 10 were aware that California had set up a health insurance exchange. This month we wanted to find out how well they thought it was working, especially in light of the problems that have been happening with the healthcare.gov site and in other states. California obviously started their planning process a lot earlier than other states, but they haven't been immune from some issues with their website. And there's sort of a couple ways to look at this issue. When you're talking about the sheer number of enrollees, Covered California has been successful. The figures I read, as of January 15th, they had signed up more than 625,000 people. But the share of Latinos signing up is sort of out of proportion to the share eligible, and many have complained about some actual problems with the website. So we find among Californians, 46% think that the online exchange is working very or fairly well. 39% say it's working not too or not at all well. And this is sort of a perfect picture of partisanship in California. We find 55% of Democrats saying that it's working well, an almost identical share of Republicans saying it's not working well, and then independents evenly divided. This question we adapted from a Pew Research Center question that was asked nationwide about states, a more general question about how states' online exchanges were working. We adapted it obviously to mention Covered California specifically. But when they asked their question, unfortunately they haven't asked it in January, but they did ask it in December, and they found that 30% said that the online health exchanges were working well, and 57% said that they were not. Among those who currently do not have insurance, we find that 72% say they will obtain insurance this year in accordance with the law. In December, we found that 66% had said that they would get insurance in 2014. There have been concerns nationwide and in the state about signing up young and healthy people to really complete the pool. And there have been concerns in California about signing up Latinos. Our surveys from last month and this month show that strong majorities of those age 18 to 34 say that they're going to sign up, and strong majorities of Latinos say that they're going to sign up. Okay. We had 2 questions in the survey about immigration policy. Congress may or may not take up this issue again after talks stalled following the Senate passing a bill last year. In California, we find very strong and bipartisan support for the type of reform that the Senate bill had proposed, which would provide a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants who met certain requirements, including a waiting period, paying fines and back taxes, passing criminal background checks, and learning English. We asked this question in September as well, and the findings were very similar. This was a CBS News poll question, and when they asked the question in October, they also found very strong support among adults nationwide at 77%. And then, as featured on this slide, you can see there's really strong support across racial and ethnic groups, and especially among Latinos at 92%. But in light of the federal government inaction on immigration and what's been going on at the state level, we wanted to ask how Californians feel about the state making its own immigration policies separate from the federal government to address the needs of illegal immigrants currently in the state. We find that 58% of Californians favor the idea of the state making its own immigration policies. It's 53% among likely voters. Republicans are divided on the issue, while majorities of Democrats and independents favor the idea. And just as reference, I mean, just in the last legislative session, bills were passed that would make it harder for law enforcement to detain illegal immigrants if they were otherwise eligible to be released. The driver's license law passed. Undocumented immigrants can now be admitted to the state bar as attorneys. So 58% of Californians are sort of in step with this line of action. Okay, so we can move into the question. I'll just sum up real quickly, and then I'll take any questions that you have. So one of the key findings from the survey this month is the record high job approval for Governor Brown. We also find that Californians support this idea of fiscal prudence and are very supportive of Governor Brown's budget and rainy day proposals. Californians far more pessimistic about prospects for cooperation at the federal than state levels. And we do find that most of the uninsured say that they'll get insurance this year. Okay, thank you very much.